Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a day I'm very much looking forward to. The last exchange with the questions about how landscapes store and release water is really a nice setup for what I'll try to talk about. I'd like to get at some of the basic processes of how hill slopes, small catchments, store and release water, because these processes aren't yet incorporated in our land surface models. And I think, as you heard from David, in terms of the hydrological model intercomparison, that's the thing that we desperately need, I think, to make advancements in terms of prediction. And prediction's difficult, especially when the thing we've used as engineering hydrologists, the past is the key to the future in terms of the statistical distribution of our rainfall inputs, for example. That is no longer valid. We had a beautiful talk yesterday by Freddie Otto from Oxford University on this topic in the department here. And this is because stationarity is dead. This idea that the climate locally is stable, and we're able to use that for prediction to the future is really problematic. We have areas that are snow dominated that are increasingly less snow dominated because that's changing to rainfall, and other changes that are happening. And this makes design very difficult. I think a good quote to link the processes to this is by a colleague of mine, James Famiglietti. Jay is on his way to my institute, actually, to take on a position. But he testified in a drought hearing back in 2012 in the US. And this quote, I think, is particularly apt. How can we manage water for the benefit of mankind in these non-stationary times when we know so little about its various stores, flow paths, and residence times, even in a developed country like the United States? And as David showed, this gets just so much more difficult when you go to the developing world and where UNESCO is trying to have an impact, where data is so scant and understanding these things is so difficult. So what I want to do for the next half hour or so is to give you a small overview of how storage and release works, perhaps at the hill slope and watershed scale. And then this new science of tracking raindrops with tracers. Tracers used in many disciplines. The medical community uses them in cancer studies. Biologists use tracers like the FACE experiment at BI4. Hydrologists have embraced this in a big way as well. And I'll talk about some of the new things that tracers are revealing and then end with a kind of a future outlook. But this is kind of a schematic on the left that I'm hoping you can keep in mind. It's this kind of headwater catchment, how hill slopes are connecting to catchments that I'd like to explore. And of course, the birth of much of this study is here in the UK. My hydrological heroes, Malcolm Anderson on top and Tim Burt. Malcolm's at Bristol, is just retired. Tim Burt at Durham, just retired. A lot of the seminal work in this area has come from southern England in particular, and these process studies through the 1970s and 1980s. And it's really interesting to kind of reflect on the technology back then. Then the UK was a leader, as it is today. Again, you saw a vivid example of that with the sensor networks. And these all happened as part of the British Geomorphological Research Group, who are really promoting innovations in sensor technology to understand how hill slopes work. Where does water go when it rains? You needed instruments to be able to do that. And one breakthrough was something called the scanny valve. This seems so antiquated now, but this is something I used in my PhD studies in the mid-1980s. And this was developed here by Tim and Malcolm. And it was a way to make pore pressure measurements in the soil and distribute that across a hill slope to understand how during rain events, hill slopes would develop saturation and start to shed water. And often that shedding was subsurface. The human eye wasn't able to detect it, but these sensors enabled that. This was really a breakthrough. So this is kind of our history, and it's interesting that we're seeing innovations in the sensor technology driven by a lot of these UK studies. I spent about 20 years as a professor in the United States going around the world trying to test these ideas that were born out of these field studies here in the UK. And my colleagues called this approach Frankenstein hydrology. I'd go to sites and rip great trenches along the base of hill slopes to try to understand how these hill slopes are taking in the rainfall and then releasing it. as a quest to understand the basic processes of lateral movement of water in the landscape. I'll show you one or two examples, and maybe three things we learned along the way. One of the things we learned was that when you slice a hill slope and try to monitor internally where the water is going, what you find often is that this saturation is building not from the bottom up as a saturated wedge, but almost from the top down, this kind of filling and spilling through a rain event. And this helped us really go beyond perhaps this early work, knowing that the subsurface boundary is really quite irregular and has a big impact for how hill slopes then release water into the riparian zone around the channel or directly to a stream itself. If we look at a real hill slope, this is a site in the southeast United States in Georgia. Here we can see the surface topography is fairly planar, but down at that soil bedrock interface, it's quite variable. And our soils are notoriously spatially variable. We rarely take that into account. What we find, though, if we go to a hill slope like this and take a trench section along the base, and we understand that here's a picture of the hill slope, perhaps looking a bit like the By4 site, just not too far from here. What I want to show you is, if we look at this hill slope now in plan view, these are wells that we've put in across this hill slope. We've kind of made Swiss cheese, if you like, out of this hill slope. Here's the trench along the base of the slope. And what I want to look at is now the effects of that variable soil depth in terms of this filling and spilling or connectivity of these zones of saturation. The key thing to remember is that lateral flow in the subsurface is really driven by these connected patches of saturation. For small events, these are rainfall events, 9 millimeters, 16 millimeters, we get patches of saturation, but they don't coalesce, they don't connect up. Here's a bigger event. These are all separate rain events, 29 millimeters, 50 millimeters. Here's an event now, we're getting up to 60 millimeters or so, and we have connectivity across the slope. Remember, the base of the slope is shown here at the bottom. Here's a bigger event. And the upshot of this is that if we look at storm rainfall, we need about 50 or 60 millimeters to turn on this hill slope, because the y-axis is the flow from this hill slope. So what we learned is that this filling and spilling leads to patterns of connectivity that have this kind of emergent behavior in terms of turning on the landscape, releasing water, releasing nutrients. So this has a big effect on the biogeochemistry of our sites as well. We've gone to different parts of the world. This is a site where I worked for many years in New Zealand, showing same behavior. Each dot's a different rainfall runoff event. Now the threshold is a bit less. It only takes about 20 millimeters to activate this landscape. Same plot of rainfall versus flow. Or you could go to a much more topographically challenged landscape, this one in South Carolina, in the coastal plain, and now you need almost a tropical storm to induce flow from these hill slopes. We've gone, I guess I became rather obsessed about this because these red dots show the places where we've done this trenching over that 2-decade period. And in all of these sites, what we found was really something quite similar in terms of sequence. We have a kind of a soil bedrock interface of sorts that leads to patches of saturation, and when you get connectivity, you see a kind of a threshold-like behavior and release of water and solutes from the slope. But of course, this is all masked in the uniform ups and downs of the storm hydrograph in the stream, the thing that we're trying to measure. So this is like trying to unscramble the omelet. How do you go from a rainfall runoff relationship, which is being shown on the top there, to unpack these kinds of processes? I think the way we unpack it is to realize that these thresholds are really what's driving the response, and we follow a very predictable sequence across quite diverse environments of filling, loss along the flow path, spilling, resulting in connectivity, and then runoff. I think this is what we're trying to now build into our land surface models, but we're probably still many years or decade or more away from that. The other thing I've learned moving back to Canada and working in Saskatchewan, maybe the most topographically challenged place on the planet, is that it seems like the things that I've been searching for in the subsurface for many years are staring me right in the face in terms of what's going on with runoff processes in this kind of landscape. This is a photo from Michael Chu from North Dakota State University, but showing this kind of filling and spilling of surface flow. And we found it in terms of snowmelt on frozen ground. Surprisingly, this kind of fill and spill behavior applies to the surface in terms of the partitioning. You think of an environment like this, topography is the last thing you'd need to take into account during a rain event because it's pretty much flat and everything's going vertically. But we have frozen ground down to about 2 meters. The only hydrological event of any consequence during the year is a brief 2 or 3 week snowmelt period. And here, really, this filling and spilling on the frozen surface is what's delivering the water to our reservoirs and systems that we manage on the prairie. So that was a kind of a whirlwind overview of maybe some of the things we've learned in hill slope hydrology. Let's now look at hill slope hydrology when it's not raining, meaning much of the focus in our field is understanding the delivery of water during rain or snowmelt events. What I want to look at now is between events, how do these hill slope processes link to groundwater recharge, the deeper storage, the stored water, as we heard in the previous talk, is so key, and then also transpiration, because of course the water balance of many of our catchments, transpiration is a key factor. In many cases, more than half of the water loss from the landscape is through transpiration. And the tool I'm going to take advantage of here is the stable isotope composition of water, O18 and deuterium. These are a natural part of the water molecule, and it's something that in our water cycle that we all learn in high school, we can understand now, both for vapor and for liquid, the signature of that water. This is showing the O18 signal in units of per mil. You don't have to worry about the units. The idea is that we can sample these positions in the water cycle, if you like, and track these raindrops almost like a fingerprinting. These are naturally occurring. They're applied during rain and snowmelt events. They're linked to air mass trajectories. Of course, this is used in the climate change community, reconstructing past climates from ice cores. You've probably seen much of this. Hydrologists take advantage of this as well. And the way we do that is to look at our catchment and we compare the input to the output during or between rain events. Here I'm showing a O18 on the y-axis, and this is over 6 or 7 years. The signals are more negative in the winter, more positive in the summer. So what you're seeing is this kind of cyclic input. This would be what the input would look like at the Byforce site, for example. The catchment then acts as a filter, and it's really damping and lagging that signal. And the amount of damping and lagging really gives us key insight into things like the transit time or the residence time of water. How long it takes that water molecule on average to make its way through the system. If this was a Tesco parking lot, of course, the right-hand side would look identical to the left-hand side. But our catchments that have infiltrability, maybe are forested, this damping is really linked to the storage in the system. So it's a great proxy for how much water might be stored in our hill slopes and catchments. A great example of that, I think, comes from Luxembourg. Luxembourg is blessed with very diverse geology. Here's a map, not of all of Luxembourg, but almost. It's a tiny country, as you know, less than 5,000 square kilometers. But we have 16 catchments that we've been monitoring now for some time, working with Laurent Pfister at the Luxembourg Institute for Science and Technology, some of you may know. And these 16 catchments cover mixed or clean expressions of different rock types, from sandstone to marl, with varying degrees of kind of bedrock permeability. Think of this as sponginess, if you like, of the subsurface. And what we find with this isotope technique, where we look at the damping and calculate the age of that stream water, that the amount of permeable or impermeable bedrock really influences strongly. We can explain a large amount of the variance of the age of that water based on the rock type. So the sandstone, the most spongy, if you like, has the oldest water, and the marls and other rocks that are quite impermeable are shedding water and have very young water dominating their streams. And the size of the dot represents the flow of the water in these rivers. Now, an interesting thing is we've been working with a brewery who's drawing water from that sandstone aquifer. And they've done carbon age dating of this water they're using for the brewery as part of their sustainability planning. And that water is 27,000 years old. 27,000 years old, and yet the water in our streams are only 1 or 2 years old. This has been a puzzle, and we've now gone to well data around the world, led by one of my recent postdocs, Scott Giuseco, who's now a professor at UC Santa Barbara. And we've tried to accumulate well information from just over 6,000 wells that have isotope data where we can actually do the age dating of these groundwater. And what we find is this water is really quite old. So now we're looking at depth below the land surface from 0 down to 600 meters. So we're going pretty deep now, deeper than a hill slope hydrologist would usually tread. And then along the x-axis is a selection of many of these well sites coming from these maps. The take-home message is that this water, particularly when you get down below about 250 meters, is quite old, older than 10,000 years, something we call fossil water. So in our catchments, where we're dealing with topographic relief often well below or well beyond 250 meters, this is significantly old water, and yet the water in our streams is quite young. And understanding that connection, I think, is still a grand challenge in hill slope and catchment hydrology. The other thing we found is that half of these wells, that is the wells with fossil water, had detectable tritium, meaning that in addition to being fossil water, they had some presence of modern water, water less than, say, 50 or 60 years old. This could indicate preferential flow like you might have in the chalk here in England, or it could indicate poor well construction practices. We don't know. But it's interesting when you reflect on our catchments, particularly in areas with significant topographic relief, how this deep groundwater connects to stream water is puzzling. Now, there's been new theory in this regard. Jim Kirshner and one of his new postdocs at ETH Zurich have had a very nice paper last year in GRL, the relationship between contrasting ages of groundwater and stream flow. And they tried to explain these data based on the kind of permeability ratio, if you like, of the soil, this thing that hill slope hydrologists have focused on for many decades, and then what lies below. So if you look at this ratio of kind of the residence time of groundwater, these very long ages I mentioned, to the transit time of water in the stream, this is really affected by this ratio of conductivities, if you like, or permeabilities between these layers. And they proposed this kind of this is quite theoretical. And like physics, I think we're really struggling with data. We're struggling to make measurements. We're struggling to now see whether or not this kind of theory is applicable in the field. We've started doing this with a backpackable drill rig. It's very difficult to access these headwater catchments. This is our site in New Zealand. One of my intrepid PhD students, Chris Gabrielli. Here's the drill string going up, 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 up. We can get about 10 meters down into the rock. And we, in New Zealand, we backpack it in. At our catchments in Mexico, we use donkeys. Whatever means we have, we get to these sites and we drill down into the rock. And our goal is to try to understand the connection then between the shallow and the deep. This is really a grand challenge for making projections of how streams are going to change into the future. What we've done for about 40 wells we drilled into this rock in this small catchment, we've looked at the age of the groundwater that we've age dated with tritium, a way that we can calculate the groundwater age. And then we run a hydrologic model, a groundwater model effectively, and we see whether or not the model can replicate both the water table elevation but also the age of the groundwater. And now, armed with a model that we think is working for the right reasons, we can then look at where that water goes when it rains. And what we find is in these headwater basins, about half of the water that's recharging groundwater is now subsidizing the larger watershed down valley from where it's sitting. So this idea of groundwater subsidy, I think, is helping us understand how these small catchments link to larger catchments, how the system is plumbed effectively in terms of the fate of water drops when we're adding rainfall and snowmelt to these catchments. Now, we talked a little bit about the subsurface boundary. Let's end with some talks on the trees, because these are wicking away often at least half of the water that's falling onto the watershed. And the question is, where do trees get their water? And it turns out you can sample a tree just like you can sample a stream. You don't want to sample the leaves in areas where complex isotope fractionation processes occur, but you can tap the tree in terms of sampling the xylem water, the water that's moving vertically and drawing water from the root network. And we can analyze that isotopically and ask, where's the tree getting its water? If we can sample the soil water down through the profile, we can actually get the source distribution of water in the tree and try to understand its link to some of these other hydrological processes. Again, these isotope tracers as a conservative tracer of water in our systems. And most of the work to date has assumed that what the tree is drawing on is basically the same water that would otherwise go to groundwater recharge or be shed laterally as stormwater runoff. So we started by testing this kind of general wisdom, if you like, of how trees and hill slopes connect. And what we found was something rather puzzling. Just look on the left-hand side. The left-hand side is kind of what we see in our streams. I showed you this diagram in the upper right-hand corner of the rainfall varying in a kind of a sinusoidal way in terms of its input to the catchment, looking at O18. We can look at O18 versus the other isotope of water in a bivariate plot. And this is, we call it the meteoric water line. This blue is basically that sinusoidal swing. That swing now is applied in this dual isotope space. And now here's the stream water as a lagged and damped version of that input. So basically we're looking at the same thing as you're seeing in the cartoon and looking at now in this dual isotope space. The really surprising thing is when we sample trees, or these vascular plants that are wicking away much of our hill slope water, these plant waters plot out in a very strange area that we don't see in our mobile waters that we sampled. And when we sample the soil water using special techniques to get out all the soil water, what we find is that the soil water too is following that kind of sinusoidal pattern, and the trees are a lagged and damp version of it. The issue though is that these waters aren't talking to those waters and vice versa. This is something we call eco-hydrological separation, or the two water worlds hypothesis. The idea that the trees are drawing on water pools that aren't mobile enough to ever make it to groundwater recharge or to stream runoff. And the runoff that we sample doesn't seem to be the water that the trees are interested in using. We've tested this. We came up with this with single site investigations about 10 years ago. Recently, we've tested it with about 50 sites where we had access to data, the tree data, the groundwater data, the rainfall data, stream flow data, and we could look at the mobile water that hugs that line. It's called the meteoric water line. The stream flow and the groundwater from these sites are all falling on that line, just like the cartoon we saw earlier, but the plant water here and the soil water are drifting off at a shallower slope and really separating in terms of where they position. And this has suggested that this finding is more widespread than we might otherwise have thought. This has big consequences because really it's saying we don't understand how the mixing occurs in the subsurface. And of course, biogeochemically, this has enormous consequences for flushing of labile nutrients and the like. The last slide I'll show you is some new work we've done on trying to ask the question, well, how old is that transpired water? It's been a tough one to get at because we don't have a lot of techniques to enable us to explore that. But one place where we can go to really try to extract an answer on this is the Loess Plateau in China. As you may know, this is an area about the size of France with very deep homogeneous sequences of silty soil. Water tables are down about 50 meters, so we have a huge unsaturated zone that we can play with. They're doing afforestation on an unprecedented scale in the Loess Plateau, and many of the trees they're planting are apple trees. And apples we can pick and we can squeeze and we can look isotopically at the water in the apple. And what we've done is relate that to, in this case, the bomb tritium profile in the subsurface. So here's depth, 0 going down about 20 meters. And here's the atmospheric bomb tritium signal that many of you might be familiar with in the atmosphere. Here's 1963 peak. This is when we had the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and this is now trailing off as we move deeper. And the roots of these trees, surprisingly, are reaching down 13, 14 meters. So really exploiting this whole profile. So we pick the apples, we look at its tritium concentration, we relate it with mixing models to that distribution of tritium in the profile. And what we're finding at this site anyway, the apple water is 29 years old. 3-decade-old water these trees are transpiring. This really is, again, challenging our thinking about how do we parameterize transpiration in our land surface models. So I'm not presenting you with any solutions today, but I'm hoping that you're getting a taste of maybe how process studies are still important to reveal maybe how systems are plumbed and where water goes when it rains, how hill slopes and landscapes are storing water. Because our prediction challenge still is this. And of course, it's made infinitely more difficult in non-stationary times. It's not necessarily the volume of the hydrograph. We have models that can do that. It's really getting at the time and space source apportionment, if you like, of these models. This tells us maybe what the nitrate signal is in a hydrograph, because perhaps some of that nitrate is in groundwater and that's taking many decades to get to the stream, and it's blending with shallower sources. So the spatial and then the temporal is still a really vexing issue, and I think something that we've not really come to grips with yet in a prediction way. So just to wrap up, I guess what I'm saying is that some of the things we've learned building on the foundational work done here in southern England is maybe irregular subsurface topography affects this filling and spilling. These hill slopes around the world are very threshold-like, and if we adopt maybe this idea of thresholds as characteristic forms of nonlinearity, this could be a new theoretical construct for how we model this in land surface models, and surprisingly how similar each of these runoff forms are. Beyond lateral flow, kind of going deeper, we're seeing down valley subsidy of groundwater. We're finding a lot of fossil water at depth, and for groundwater hydrologists maybe that's not so surprising, but for a hill slope hydrologist it's shocking how old it gets quickly with depth. And then understanding that connection to both streams and transpired water, I think, is something that's really an exciting area of research. And I'll just end with maybe some future questions. I think really it's maybe broadening the way we approach things in these kinds of landscapes. It's asking much more general questions about how does geology and biology control the water we see in the streams? How can chemistry help answer these questions? And really, how, when, and why are these what often seem like isolated compartments connected in very episodic ways? And I'm looking forward to collaborations with the group here in terms of meshing some of these ideas with these approaches that we've been hearing about so far. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.